Welcome back to the Last Days Book Club, as we start a new short story today called Bread from Heaven. This story is also written by Bradley Booth, the author of The Miracle of the Seventh-day Ox, as well as the author of our last short story, Bibles for Breakfast. This story is set in Moldavia, an Eastern European country and a part of the former Soviet Union. Our hero is a seasoned Adventist pastor named Sergei Petrovich, and like many of the characters in our book club readings, he's persecuted for his faith and imprisoned. But God intervenes miraculously to bring him through his troubles, while at the same time using his unshakable faith to convert a very hard-hearted and cruel communist prison warden. Please enjoy this story and receive a blessing. Bread from Heaven, Chapter 1. It was a warm evening. Spring was well on its way in the town of Kahul, and Pastor Sergei Petrovich was glad to see it come. Spring was his favorite time of the year, with its famous blossoming orchards and rows of grape vineyards. Dusk had come, trading daylight for darkness. Sweet-smelling lilac bushes were already in bloom, their fragrance wafting in through the open window of the small house that Sergei shared with his wife Lena. Near the open window, crickets were tuning up to accompany a warbler singing an evening sonnet. Sergei sat reading in an overstuffed chair, poring over Bible passages in preparation for the message he was scheduled to give on Sabbath morning. He adjusted his reading glasses, glanced at the chime clock on the wall, and then at his pretty wife Lena, who sat opposite of him in the small room of their cozy home. It was almost time for him to leave for one of his secret meetings with the church leaders. Tonight, they would be electing a new conference president for the church in the country of Moldova. The leaders always kept the meetings secret, so the communist government wouldn't know the church's business. Up until a day or two before each meeting, no one ever really knew when or where the meetings were to be held, and all with good reasons. If an announcement for the upcoming meeting was broadcasted too many days before the meeting, it often had a way of getting back to KGB headquarters. Instead, the message was usually sent out strategically through the social grapevine. The pastors' wives would share the information quietly with one another at the farmer's market, or maybe when they visited in groups to make quilts. Then again, sometimes the pastors would go for walks together in the evenings so they could talk. That was how the grapevine operated, and it worked pretty well for church business. But none of these tricks could deter the KGB indefinitely. On many occasions, Sergei had been stopped in the street by KGB officials and asked where and when the next secret conference meeting was going to be held. Of course, Sergei could always answer that he didn't know where, because honestly, he didn't. Generally speaking, it was common knowledge that what he didn't know couldn't be used against him. Interestingly enough, in spite of all the KGB did to threaten Moldovan Christians, from time to time the Soviet government still made public announcements about human rights that were outrageous, like the one that said all Moldavans were guaranteed freedom of religion and worship. According to the law, church members could meet to worship as long as it was during daylight hours. Such worship services were considered open meetings. This meant that on any given Sabbath, KGB spies were apt to show up to observe everyone and everything that went on at the worship services. It wasn't surprising then that the KGB did not like it when secret meetings were held to elect new church leaders. They liked to be in control, and because of this, they were a thorn in the side of the church, always watching for a chance to catch the conference board in one of its secret sessions. They knew that the board was made up of conference officials and, most importantly, pastors. They knew that the board met at least 3 times a year and that it always worked at night. To get inside information about when a meeting might be held was their main goal, and they were always trying to bribe members to serve as informers. But a sacred respect for God's work seemed to pervade the church in Moldova and its capital, Chisinau. It appeared that everyone, both Christians and non-Christians alike, had too much reverence for the church to serve as an informer or traitor. God had always blessed the local Adventist churches, and fortunately, the KGB had never been successful at pulling off one of their sting operations. And now, just that morning, Lena had brought home word that it was time for another secret meeting with the church leaders. This time, they would be meeting at the home of a believer who was a member of a small local church company. The home had been especially chosen because the leaders felt it was the least likely place a KGB officer would look. It was a very small house on the outskirts of Kehol, off any main roads or streets. The agenda for the late-night meeting was to discuss evangelism in the country of Moldova and then elect a new president of the church organization there. This was pretty important business for a church that was legally operating in broad daylight, but secretly working on the ground because they knew how the communist government really felt about their organization. They had no other choice. A double standard was obviously being practiced by the government, and the KGB was playing dirty. Government officials said nice things about Seventh-day Adventists in public meetings or when they visited as guests in their churches. They always talked about how much they wanted to cooperate with church leaders. But behind the scenes, the KGB were forever planning a strategy that would undermine the effectiveness of the church. Other local Christian churches had also suffered under the notorious hand of the KGB. Some groups reported severe treatment that bordered on downright oppression. It was common for KGB officers to be hard-hearted and even cruel sometimes in their tactics, especially if they didn't live in the local area. One such officer had been nicknamed Ivan the Terrible. A common trick he used was to send spies to mix with the members and find out where scheduled secret meetings would be held. Then later, he and his henchmen would suddenly show up with baseball bats and dogs to break up the meeting. But God had blessed the Adventist congregations and the pastors that served them. Up to now, they had always managed to meet undetected. No one could even remember a time when the KGB had been successful in breaking up a secret meeting. Sergei knew that it was partly because the Adventists were respected and had few enemies. They always did so much good in the community. For instance, when there was an epidemic of sickness in a town or village, it was the Seventh-day Adventists who always knew what to do. They had natural remedies and treatments that seemed to work like magic. And the Adventists were a quiet people. They didn't interfere with the politics of local governments, but instead busied themselves with helping others and spreading a message of hope. And although forbidden to hold public meetings for evangelism purposes, everyone knew what the Adventists stood for and who to go to if they had questions about God. Sergei got up from his chair and went to put on his shoes. It was time for the secret rendezvous. He smiled to himself as he noticed his home's cozy surroundings. Lena was an excellent housekeeper and kept the place looking spotless. The rooms in the snug little home always had a fresh look about them with everything in its place. The kitchen was always immaculate. Good smells of fresh baked bread or cakes greeted him when he came home in the evening, and Lena always had such nice-looking tablecloths spread on the supper table. And the floors were always so clean. Sergei understood that not wearing his shoes around the house was one of the reasons why. It was the custom in Russian homes to leave the shoes at the door, and Lena saw to it that everyone followed the rule. But what man with a wife like Lena could complain? Sergei gave his wife a kiss and stepped out into the night. Darkness had fully come, and with it, the shadows. That was good, since he would certainly need to avoid detection by the KGB. He couldn't afford to have anyone getting suspicious about where he was going. The end of Chapter 1. Chapter 2. The night was cool, making the evening walk invigorating. Sergei wondered where exactly the KGB spies were tonight. Did they know of the secret conference meeting being held to elect a new conference president? Were they already following him? Would they crash the meeting and arrest everyone? So many questions. But Sergei knew what he had to do in the event there was trouble. If he at all suspected anyone was following him, he would simply pretend he was going for an evening walk and then eventually make his way back home. As Sergei walked briskly up the street, he thought about the life he led as a pastor. Times were hard in Kehol, and like everyone, he and Lena were feeling the pinch of financial stress. The members in Sergei's churches could not afford to give him much. They could hardly make ends meet themselves, let alone contribute to his salary. But God is good, Sergei thought. That was the theme of his life, and he wore it like a smile. He was truly a man of God, always giving, always ready to lend a helping hand, and always a man of prayer. His parishioners loved him and looked to him for guidance and spiritual mentoring. As Sergei neared the house where they were meeting, he slowed his steps and glanced about him in the darkness for telltale signs of a KGB informer. No one under a street lamp. No agents standing on the sidewalk smoking a cigarette in the shadows. He couldn't afford to take any chances. To be doubly sure, Sergei passed the house and kept on going. He continued on down the street, turned left at the corner, and then went nonchalantly down another side street. Finally, he circled around and came back by another route. But there was no one in sight. Sergei smiled to himself in the darkness. God had again helped the leaders to disguise the whereabouts of the meeting. From all appearances, it did seem that all would be well. After a few more glances into the shadows, Sergei finally felt safe enough to relax. Evidently, there was no one out there after all. The KGB had missed the mark again. Sergei went around to the back of the house and rapped softly on the door using a secret prearranged knock. The door soon opened, and Sergei was drawn into the house by one of the pastors. The house was completely dark, and though it took some time for his eyes to adjust to the darkness, Sergei could make out the forms of his fellow colleagues. There were 14 of them. They greeted him warmly in hushed tones, and since Sergei was the last to arrive, they all bowed their heads in prayer to begin the meeting. For quite some time, they shared reports about the latest efforts in evangelism and the needs that they should be most aware of. Churches and small companies of believers were springing up everywhere. The Lord was working in a mighty way to bring the gospel to the people of Moldova. People were hungry for the Word of God. And even though the government forbade any type of open evangelism, they couldn't control the longing for God in the hearts of the Moldovan people. After this discussion, the main order of business for the evening was put on the table. Who would become the next conference president of the church in Moldova? A list of potential candidates was discussed, and many questions were asked about each man. Were these men godly? Did they possess the wisdom to lead God's Seventh-day Adventist people during the times of persecution? Was each man's wife and family standing fully and completely behind him? Finally, the discussion came down to 4 names, and the one who was receiving the most attention was sitting in the room with them. His name was Victor Petya, and he had an excellent reputation in the local churches and among the conference leaders. Pastor Petya also had years of experience as an evangelist and a publisher. For years he had worked translating the Bible and other inspirational books into the language of the Moldovan people. He had enlisted the help of women in the local churches to do the typing. At one time, he had as many as 4 typists working around the clock to turn out books for printing. To make multiple copies, they would insert 2 or 3 pieces of carbon paper between sheets of paper in the typewriter. And then, through an amazing turn of events, Pastor Petya had managed to acquire a small hand press on which he could duplicate the Bibles and books. After the books were ready, Adventist leaders smuggled them out to various towns and cities where people needed them. Some were sold secretly door to door by Christian book salesmen. Others were used for missionary work in cities where pastors were holding secret evangelistic meetings in the network of underground churches. But one of the most interesting ways of distributing books and Bibles was through regular church members. This is how it worked. One of Pastor Petya's books would be carried to church on Sabbath by a deacon or elder, and then left on the floor under the church pew. Then at some point, perhaps that Sabbath or the next, anyone who needed a book or Bible could look under the pew and take the book home for himself if he needed it. In this way, the place where the book had been printed remained a secret, as well as the identity of the one who had left the book. If anyone ever was caught with the book in his home or in his hands on the street, he could honestly say, "I don't know where the book came from originally or who printed it." And so, Pastor Petya's name kept coming up as a man with leadership experience, a love for the gospel, and an undying devotion for his church. After several hours of deliberation, the men were finally ready to vote. Small slips of paper were passed among them, and each was told to write down the name of the man he thought was most qualified for the job as president. The papers were collected and taken to an inner room in the house where the votes were counted by candlelight. And so it was that Pastor Victor Petya was unanimously elected that night as the new conference president. The men congratulated Pastor Petcher on his new assignment. Then they bowed their heads in prayer and asked God to bless him as their new leader. Finally, they all left the house and went their separate ways. Sergei returned home by a different route than he had come. When he arrived home, Lena was already sleeping, so he slipped into bed without waking her. A cool breeze rustled the curtains hanging in the open bedroom window. Sergei could hear the late-night crickets still merrily chirping their screechy songs, and somewhere down the street, a lone dog was barking. He settled down onto his soft pillow and contemplated the previous few hours, relieved that the important meeting was finally over and that the secret police had once again been fooled as to where the conference leaders were holding a meeting. It had been a good evening. But if Sergei thought everything was under control, he was sadly mistaken and in for a shock. He had drifted into a pleasant sleep when suddenly there was an unexpected and violent pounding on the front door of his home. The end of Chapter 2. Chapter 3. At first, Sergei's groggy mind could not grasp what was happening, but the pounding continued. Was he dreaming? Was it his imagination working overtime, even at this late hour when the whole world should be sleeping? Was there someone at the door? He struggled to wake himself from the deep slumber into which he had fallen. But finally, through the cobwebs of sleep, he began to realize that there was indeed someone at the door. And then suddenly, Lena was sitting up in the bed and shaking him wide awake. "The secret police," she whispered hoarsely. "It's got to be the secret police." In the next instant, Sergei leaped out of bed to answer the incessant pounding. When he opened the door, several burly policemen in uniform roughly pushed their way inside. "Gentlemen," Sergei fumbled for the light switch. "What's this all about?" Though he was wide awake, everything seemed like a dream as he squinted at the light now flooding the room. A stocky, sophisticated-looking man, dressed in a dark blue suit, entered the house close behind the police. The man's jaw was square-cut, his mustache distinguished-looking, and he had on an expensive-looking hat. He took one quick glance around the room and then turned to Sergei. "We have come to take you back to headquarters," he announced briskly. "Let's go." "Why? What have I done?" Sergei looked at the officer in confusion. "What am I being charged with?" "Conducting an illegal meeting during nighttime hours and attempting to conceal it." In spite of the man's gruff manner, Sergei could tell he felt guilty for disturbing them at such an hour. "Do you have proof of these charges?" "The KGB needs no proof." The officer glanced around the room again, no longer bothering to look directly at Sergei. "We only need suspicion of such actions. Put on your clothes," he ordered impatiently. "We must be going." Sergei knew the charges were serious. Conducting secret meetings was considered an act of treason, punishable by beatings, prison, and on rare occasions, even execution. Sergei sent up a prayer. "Help me be strong, Lord. I knew that someday they might come for me, and now it looks like they finally have." His mind raced like lightning as he contemplated his next move. Would they even let him take anything with him? He didn't know. Should he take clothes? Would he need food or books? And how long would he be staying? He didn't know. The truth was, he didn't know anything. "Shall I take a few things in a bag?" Sergei asked. He was thinking clearly now. But if he had any illusions about generosity on the part of the KGB, he was in for a rude awakening. "There's no time for that now," the KGB officer was emphatic. "We must go immediately." Sergei turned to see Lena standing behind him in the hallway. She was trembling. He wanted to tell her that everything was going to be all right, that there was nothing to worry about, but he knew it wasn't true. There was plenty to be concerned about. The KGB didn't come barging into one's home at such an unearthly hour, unless they had good reason. "It'll be all right, dear," Sergei replied. "Everything is in God's hands." He turned to the KGB officer. "I'd like to say goodbye to my wife, sir. Will you allow me that much?" The KGB officer simply nodded his head in the direction of Lena. What Sergei said during the next few moments, he would probably never remember, but Lena certainly would. "God is good, Lena." Sergei took her in his arms. "Jesus has been watching over us and holding us in the palm of his hand since the day we were born. He won't abandon us now." He smiled bravely, but inside, he was quaking. Where were these men going to take him? And what were they going to do with him? "If I don't see you for a while, Lena, please try to be brave. God will be with you. He will be with both of us." Sergei swallowed hard. "I want you to write to your brother and see if you can go stay with him and his family for a while. You and he are close. I don't want you to have to be alone." Sergei glanced at the KGB officer and then at Lena again. He led her to a chair where she sat down, covered her face with her hands, and began to cry softly. "Lena, listen to me." Sergei's voice was gentle but serious, and something in it made Lena lift her face for a moment to stop crying. "I don't know what's going to happen to me. Jesus told us long ago that if we serve him, we might have to suffer for the sake of the gospel." He shook his head slowly. "Well, now we're definitely suffering for Christ. But that's okay," he assured us. "And if we..." He stopped and tried again to say what was in his heart. "If we should not see each other again on this earth, I'll be looking for you in heaven." Lena's eyes widened in fear, and Sergei pulled her close to him to stifle a fresh batch of tears. "Let's go," the KGB officer ordered as he stepped towards Sergei. "We've wasted enough time." Lena clutched at Sergei's arm, but one of the guards pulled him free. "Please be brave," Sergei reminded her. "God will take care of us. He wouldn't ask us to suffer for him if he didn't think we could bear it." Sergei looked at his wife tenderly. "I love you, dear. Remember, all things work together for good for those who are called to be a part of God's plan." And then he was gone. The end of chapter 3 of Bread from Heaven.